basically it's a message in using your privilege, right? Like, use your privilege to elevate voices and to make sure that when you're having these conversations about what it looks like to restore Roe or anything else, right, that you're recognizing who needs to be at the table and who's not. So I would hope survivors continue to be heard. I would hope anyone, right? Anyone who's young, young people 18 through 25 need Roe. So I just think it's so important to continue to have these conversations. And gosh, I cannot wait for the day that Roe is restored.
So true. Me too. So next is, I was going to ask, what's in the blog, it says, specifically about Roe versus Wade, it says, we will continue to build solidarity across movements to advance equity. And can you elaborate really on how Valor has used equity to broaden movements and become inclusive towards voices that can be times excluded in sexual violence conversations, and how sexual violence can be prevented in certain atmospheres? Absolutely. Let me know if it's like, if I need to deconstruct certain questions, because I feel like they're very long.
No problem. And if you feel like I don't answer it, let me know. So let's think about this. Okay, from a partnership building perspective, right? Like, I think, this is hard to say, but it has to be said. I think that the sexual violence field got comfortable, and they were used to having Roe around. Like I mentioned earlier, that what used to take an afternoon to get someone to a reproductive care clinic now maybe takes 3 to 4 weeks. And so I think that one of the biggest challenges for the sexual violence field right now is flexing that muscle and learning how to have these conversations, learning how to speak the reproductive justice speak, and learning how to build partnerships with organizations that maybe historically we haven't shown up for them. And so it's coming up and saying, I'm sorry, and I'm ready to work with you. What can I do? How can I mobilize? Who should I call? I am here to work with you because our work is so interconnected. And then from a Valor's advancing equity perspective is, at Valor, we have conversations frequently about who does not have access, right? Especially within reproductive justice, like who doesn't have access? There are 27 states right now with abortion bans in effect. It's 22 million people of reproductive age who do not have access to reproductive care, which is insane. And so it's thinking about, okay, well, maybe there's an organization in Alabama who could use our help right now, who could use our capacity to mobilize, who recognizes that we're a sexual violence agency that cares about restoring reproductive justice. And so by Valor stepping in and saying, this is what we prioritize, right? Like, we know that reproductive justice and the work to achieve it and restore reproductive rights is its own entity. However, we can't have an end to sexual violence without reproductive justice. We can't have an end to sexual violence without economic justice, without healthcare justice, without access to education, and without access to food, right? And I think that's where it's really important to consider, what does equity really mean? And that's where it comes into play, that we can't end sexual violence without advancing equity.
So true. I love that. Okay, so one of my last questions is, how are you dealing with sometimes how certain conversations have become so stigmatized, really dealing with sex and sexual consent? So when you're dealing with these programs, the constant politicization and polarization of Roe versus Wade or Planned Parenthood or even abortions, what advice does Valor give us to really create advocacy around this that doesn't revolve around specific political parties, but rather creating a united front against sexual violence?
Absolutely. Let me pull up another. I think there's a blog post that we released. Yeah. I'm going to give you this language. So specifically, what we tend to recognize in a lot of these conversations is that they're rooted in equity. And ending sexual violence is rooted in equity. Restoring reproductive rights is rooted in equity, and so on and so forth. So that is kind of key in all of this. And when you're saying like, this is an equity issue, we cannot be forcing births or taking away access or so on and so forth, knowing that by making decisions that are harmful to people, you are harming a larger movement. And one decision that might not seem that bad could actually be really bad. And so I think it's about prioritizing communities, especially communities that have been harmed consistently, and using those talking points to say, look, we are all invested in the well-being of other people, in the well-being of ourselves, and the well-being of communities. And so by us saying this is an equity issue and we need to be showing up and we need to be using our space to recognize that this is important, then that helps soften some edges. And don't get me wrong, it's not all roses all the time. There have been times that it, especially, not especially, but while working at Valor, where I've run into issues with someone who maybe doesn't see eye to eye with what Valor is doing. And that's fine. You're entitled to your opinion and to the work that you're doing. And this is the work that Valor deeply believes in. All of our staff wake up every single day and choose to do this work because we care really deeply about it. We want to end sexual violence on a national level. We want to support our California rape crisis programs. We want to make this state and this nation a healthier, safer place for people to live and thrive. And there are going to be people who disagree with Valor, and that's okay. And there are also going to be people who are some of our biggest advocates, and that's also great. So at the end of the day, it can be tough work, and that's okay.
That's beautiful. Okay, so another question I have for you is, I saw on Valor's website, there's a lot of branches and opportunities for advocates to get involved. So I was wondering if you can explain or elaborate on what opportunities are great for youth to get involved, and a different question you can go over later, but what is really an obligation of all of us to take our part in the fight against ending sexual violence?
Absolutely. We have quite a few upcoming trainings that are happening. So do you want me to like send any of the links to you, or what would be easiest? I know that, yeah, go ahead.
Oh, whatever's easiest for you. If you send the links out, that is perfectly fine.
Okay. A lot of these trainings are for adults, so I will say that, and a lot of them are for direct service providers. But we have a lot of work coming up with like our immigration work, our detention center stuff, the restorative school-based practices training, and a lot of that is for adults. And as far as work with youth, I think our biggest project that we have right now is this like overarching reproductive justice work. And knowing that the largest voter turnout, especially in the midterm, well, in 2020 and in the midterm elections, were people ages 18 to 25. And we cannot do this work without people 18 to 25. So right now there's a really big push for us to get young people involved. And that can be kind of hard sometimes, right? Because is a long-term game. It's not something that's going to happen overnight. So that's something that young people can continue to do. They can call their state senators, they can call their national senators or US senators, they can call their House of Reps, they can call their assembly members, whoever, right? And just make yourself known, make yourself loud, take up space. You deserve to take up space, especially once you're of voting age, right? Because then you have the right to say, this is what I do or don't want. And if I'm existing in this space, then I get to say that. So that's, I think, some of the work that young people can do right now. And at the end of the day, we all, for those of us who are interested, I will caveat with that, have work to do to end sexual violence. And whether that's prevention work in doing research, trainings, whatever primary prevention looks like, or if that's more response, right? And connecting survivors to services, eliminating barriers to connect survivors to services, or doing work that's kind of adjacent to sexual violence prevention, right? So if you work in healthcare, what does it look like to create a system that's inclusive of survivors, that's trauma informed? I know that's a buzzword we're hearing a lot right now, right? But creating trauma informed spaces. If you're a teacher, what does it mean to operate from a trauma informed lens and have lessons and conversations that are inviting to students, because you never know who's in your classroom. And I think from a young person's perspective, it's so key to make your voice heard, especially in high school, right? Like you have access to like a good amount of resources and a really great community. And so make yourself heard. I mean, I'm just like on my soapbox at this point, but I really like working with young people. Young people are the future. And, you know, there are really, really phenomenal giants in the anti-sexual violence field. I will even say my boss, David Lee, he's a deputy director at VALOR. Tomorrow's his 18th anniversary at VALOR, just at VALOR. He has been working in this field since 1980. Like, talk about a giant, someone who has done really phenomenal work. And so I want my voice to be heard by him. I know other young people want their voices heard. And we have to just recognize that like they paved a huge path for us. Like there is no way that there would be this much conversation, that we'd be seeing movies in the theater or seeing articles published in newspapers without people who have been doing this work since the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, so on and so forth. And so I think it's making space for young people, and also for young people to be connecting with people who are giants in this field, and working collaboratively, right? You're not going to get anywhere by working by yourself.
No, that's so true. And also, I want to say I appreciate all the work you've done and the time you've taken to talk to me and talk to all the people that will see this. But my few questions are for you. And so it's what's really pushed you to work at VALOR? I know you've been working here for 5 months, which you briefly said earlier. And so how has that 5 months been? How have you seen your growth, and how can you compare how you thought of sexual violence in the beginning before working and after?
Absolutely. That's a great question. I originally became interested in the anti-sexual violence world when I was in college. By the time that I had graduated college, I had probably over 200 people disclose sexual violence to me. And at the time was incredibly unprepared to handle that kind of information, and very frequently referred to campus resources. But that was kind of my first entry into recognizing what a widespread pandemic, for lack of a better word, sexual violence is. And it's a public health crisis. So with that, that kind of sparked my interest in working in this field. Prior to working at VALOR, I was working for a national organization that did violence prevention in sport. And I knew deep down that I always wanted to work for VALOR. I think that VALOR has grown tremendously. Like, we used to be California Coalition Against Sexual Assault and rebranded almost 2 years ago. And with that, we've kind of taken on this whole new meaning of what does it really mean to end sexual violence? And I just love where VALOR is heading and the conversations that we have and the people that we work with. The staff here is amazing, and they're so smart, and they're engaging, and they're asking critical questions, and they're really thinking long term about what does this mean to end sexual violence. And within my specific role, I really, really love the policy work that we're doing and having these important conversations about what policy can we pass both the state and federal level. Who should I be working with to kind of advance some of this legislation? And what does it look like long term for us? Because I think that let me think about this. There was a lot of legislation that was originally passed in like the 80s and 90s, right? Where at the time it was groundbreaking legislation. A lot of it focused on criminalization, which now this field is moving in kind of an anti-criminalization lens. And so now it's saying, yes, this is where the field was a few years ago. However, the field is a changing field. It's a movement, right? Like, it's going to constantly ebb and flow. And so some of our policy is now looking at something that maybe we haven't touched in about 20 to 30 years. And VALOR's been a part of all of that stuff, right? Like, we had staff who went to the Violence Against Women Act reauthorization signing at the White House, like our CEO and our deputy director and our old policy person got to go. And so it's just really incredible to see the direction that VALOR is heading in, that I get to be part of it, knowing that we really, really are working towards ending sexual violence in a way that is healing and equitable and focused on everyone's well-being, right? And really making sure that we are caring deeply about our larger community.
Yes, that was beautiful. So we are near the end because you have answered all of my very long and lengthy questions. So thank you. But again, I appreciate all the work you do and VALOR does for California and for national and state legislation against or ending sexual violence. So thank you. I will stop the recording now. And how do I do this? Okay.